We're now going live to Adelaide, where the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens is addressing the American Chamber of Commerce.
We will never know how many, but the number is certainly a large one. Almost as a matter of arithmetic, what that meant...
OK, and we're just trying to sort out some sound problems with our live feed from Adelaide. This is the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens. We might leave Glenn Stevens and see if we can fix up that audio and bring it straight back to you. Our top stories. The UN Secretary-General has used his toughest language yet to condemn the Syrian government. Ban Ki-moon says Bashar al-Assad has lost his legitimacy. It comes as details emerge of another massacre of civilians.
This video, posted on the internet by opposition activists, shows some of those killed near the village of Kubia, including young children. There's no independent evidence yet, but local activists blame Shabia militia, loyal to President Assad's regime.
They have killed 78 civilians, and the rest of the village, which is very small population, could flee to other villages. I personally could mobile one of them. He described very horrible scenes to me.
The government's account is quite different. Syrian state television said a terrorist group committed a horrific crime. A government statement says the inhabitants of the farm appealed to the authorities for protection, and they responded by killing a terrorist cell. The head of the UN mission in Syria says a team sent to verify reports of a massacre was stopped by the Syrian army. And the UN Secretary-General says they were also shot at. Ban Ki-moon told a special session of all UN countries in New York that President Assad's regime had lost all legitimacy. The UN's Special Envoy Kofi Annan admitted his peace plan was not being implemented by government or opposition and gave this warning.
The abuses are continuing. The country is becoming more polarized and more radicalized. If things do not change, the future is likely to be one of brutal repression, massacres, sectarian violence, and even all-out civil war.
Recent evidence supports that. This is apparently a Syrian armoured vehicle being totally destroyed. Together with other separate incidents, it suggests the regime is under mounting pressure from opposition fighters, with backing and weapons from Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
And we're going to return to Adelaide now, where we believe we've fixed up the problems, the sound problems, and the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens is speaking to the American Chamber of Commerce.
That will see business capital spending rise to a 50-year high over the next year or two. It's certainly true that we face some considerable structural adjustment issues that arise from the mining expansion and from other things that are happening in the global economy. And they're not easy to deal with, although they're hardly insurmountable. And we live in a global environment of major uncertainty, not least because of all the things that are going on in Europe. Nonetheless, it has to be said, I think, that an objective observer that came to our country from elsewhere would surely see our glass as at least half full. Yet the nature of our public discussion is unrelentingly gloomy, and that was true even before the recent events in Europe that have cast something of a pall over global financial markets. We are, and we have been, grimly determined to see the glass as half empty. You know, we get quite a few visitors from abroad at the Reserve Bank, and they all remark on how pessimistic people seem to be when they come to Australia. I travel overseas quite a lot, and it always strikes me how different the perception of foreigners is of our country viewed from afar compared with what I read in the newspapers at home. Now, I harbour no illusion that we can suddenly lift that today by anything I say, but it is hopefully worthwhile to offer a few facts and a bit of analysis of our situation. Much of our discussion proceeds under the rubric of the so-called two-speed economy or multi-speed economy. It's become very much a description of the moment, almost a cliche, and not only in Australia. In fact, you hear very much this theme in many other parts of the world. In fact, it's a description of the global economy. We have growth in the advanced industrial countries is struggling, whereas growth in the emerging world, by and large, when they haven't been hit by natural disasters, has been pretty robust, at least so far. Within Europe, you have Germany has done quite well. Other countries in Europe, as we know, are really struggling, some of them facing extraordinarily difficult times. So in popular terms, I guess you might say that on the global growth highway, there are a number of lanes: fast, not so fast, slow, very slow, and there are some countries in the breakdown lane. In Australia, we've always had, in fact, a multi-speed economy when you think about it. It's been a long-running trend that population growth in WA or Queensland is faster than in, say, South Australia or Tasmania. And you see that reflected in certain industries, like house building would be a typical example. While we debate the rise of mining and the decline of manufacturing, so-called, we might note that a decline in the share of manufacturing in GDP has been a trend that's been going on in this country and indeed in most advanced Western countries for about 50 years. In fact, the reversal of size relatively of mining and manufacturing is taking the respective shares of those two industries in our GDP back to where it was 100 years ago. It's obvious, of course, that the mining expansion is quite concentrated, both industrially and geographically, and the economic data certainly display that. But the mining sector is not the only sector growing at all. If we take the data released earlier this week at face value, the non-mining economy grew at about 2% over the past year, which is probably a little lower than average, but it's growth nonetheless. It's true that mining employment is growing quite quickly, and indeed, according to the data we have, the rise in mining employment over the past year was larger than the decline in manufacturing employment. But other sectors are also seeing growth in jobs. The largest increase of all was in a sector called healthcare and social services, or social assistance. And in that sector, the rise in employment was about equal to the combined fall in employment in manufacturing and retailing over the past 12 months. While there are clearly different drivers by industry and by region, there are mechanisms that even out at least some of these differences. Spillovers do occur, both in the private sector and through the tax and expenditure system. Remarkably, in the face of the understandable concerns that people have had about high-profile job losses in particular industries over the past year, when you look at the dispersion of unemployment rates by statistical region, and there are about 70 or so fine regions for which we have that data, the degree of dispersion today is really no larger than it's been most of the time for the past 20 years. So while there are clearly multiple speeds, and certainly in the shocks that hit the economy, they are differing by region and by industry, the total speed, which ultimately is what counts, so far seems to have been one of reasonable growth and hitherto fairly low unemployment by our historical standards. But there is one aspect of the so-called two-speed economy that I want to talk about a little bit more today, and that's the behaviour of households. I think changes here in that area lie behind a lot of the unease and dissatisfaction that we see expressed around the place at present. So I want to talk about that. Some parts of the economy that depend on household spending are still experiencing relatively weak conditions compared with what they have been used to. But that isn't because the mining spillovers haven't arrived. They're arriving. The real reason behind the changes in household behaviour have nothing to do with the mining boom. They have a lot more to do with things that happened prior to the mining boom even starting, and subsequent events which would have occurred even if the mining boom had never come along. And I want to show you the picture, try to explain that. These are updated versions of a chart I used a year or so back in another talk, and I think the same trends still hold true. Basically, what this shows is real household income and consumption spending. It's measured per person, per capita, and it's measured adjusting for inflation. And there are some trend lines here that are fitted for the period 1995 to 2005 or so. And then you can trace out the history subsequently. And in the bottom part of the graph, basically the difference between those two lines is the gross rate of saving out of current income. And the story here is quite interesting. For many years, spending grew faster than income, and the rate of saving out of current income went down. Those two statements are, of course, arithmetically really the same thing. The rate of saving fell 5 percentage points or so between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s. Not surprisingly, one of the things that helped drive this was that households thought they were getting richer. And these data show holdings of real household assets, again measured in real terms, adjusting for inflation, and measured per person. We have financial assets, non-financial assets, which is mainly houses, the total at the top, and then in the bottom panel we have the ratio of debt to assets, which is, of course, a measure of leverage. And you can see that wealth grew quite quickly. Just by way of comparison, for the value of assets, particularly the housing assets there, to grow at 6% plus a year, that's very unusual in history. The longer run average will be more like 3%. So we had fast growth in what we thought was wealth. We were gearing up our balance sheets. We were saving less out of current income as all that occurred. And we ended up in a somewhat more leveraged position as households after that had all occurred. Indeed, gross debt compared to aggregate annual income was about 70% in 1995. Today it's 150%, so it's roughly doubled over that time. Correspondingly, the share of our income as households that we spend on servicing the debt went from 7% in the mid-90s to 12% by 2007, even though interest rates in 2007 were in fact lower than they had been in the mid-1990s. Now, I think it's still not generally appreciated how striking and how unusual these trends really were. I can't say that it's unprecedented for spending to grow faster than income, because in fact that had been happening for 20 years prior to the period shown on this chart. So for 20 years before this chart, in fact, spending growth had exceeded income growth, and the saving rate had been falling since the mid-1970s. But it is very unusual in history for people to save as little from current income as they were in the mid-2000s. This is the gross saving rate shown here. The ABS also publishes a saving rate net of housing depreciation. That's the one that's commonly referred to, most of the stuff that would have been in today's papers or yesterday's papers about the national accounts. That will be the net saving rate, and that actually fell to nil during this period of declining savings. So that is very unusual. It's very unusual historically for people's real assets per person to rise at 6% a year on average over a long time. It's very unusual for households to actually withdraw equity in net terms from the housing stock to spend on other things. But in fact, as best we can tell, that was happening for several years in the mid-2000s. So all of that is very unusual. Of course, we weren't alone in seeing these trends. Similar things happened in some other countries, particularly English-speaking countries, US, Australia, US, UK, and so on. Countries that had English-speaking populations, innovative financial systems, and so on, and a big pickup in leverage. The international backdrop to all that was, in fact, a period that economists call the Great Moderation. It's called that because macroeconomic volatility declined. Business cycles were less intense, inflation was low and variable, therefore interest rates were low and variable and not very variable, low and steady. And as a result of that, compensation for risk embodied in interest rate spreads also went down a lot and were very steady. So that was that backdrop. That moderation, of course, came to a spectacular end in 2007. And with a few years of history behind us now, we can see that the behaviour of our households, along with those in a number of other countries, changed at about that time, maybe even a little before. It's pretty clear that the rate of saving reached a low point sometime around 2004. It began to increase, we know now. It wasn't as clear in the data then as it is now, but we now know they started to save a little more, slowly at first, and then much more quickly as the crisis unfolded in 2008 and 2009. Consumption spending per head actually held up very strongly initially. It reached a peak in early 2008 and then went down, as you can see, for a year or so, before resuming growth in the second half of 2009. But that growth has been much slower than had been observed previously. In the nearly 3 years now since that growth resumed, real consumption per head has risen at an annual rate of about 1.5%, rather than well over 2.5%. So more than a full percentage point lower than that earlier trend. And as you can see, the gap between where consumption would have reached had we stayed on the old trend, which surely couldn't have been sustained, but the gap between that trend, where we would have got to, and where we are, has become quite noticeable. But in fact, the rate of growth of consumption we see now is much more normal historically than that earlier strong growth that we had been seeing for 10 years or so up to 2007. So that's in fact quite a big change if you're in the retailing sector, and that is before we've talked about the growth of foreign online sales and so on and so forth. So that's quite a substantial change, but as I say, the kind of consumption growth that we see now, which is much more in line with income growth, that's actually a much more normal pattern in history than the one we used to have. No doubt reinforcing that trend is, as you can see, that the measures of wealth have stopped growing. In fact, real household assets per head today are about the same as they were 5 years ago. They had a dip in the crisis, they recovered a bit, and then they've drifted down a little over the past couple of years. And both housing prices and stock prices, which are the two main components of wealth, have followed that pattern of down, a bit of a recovery, and then drifting down a little bit since then. Now, at some point, I think we can expect wealth to start increasing again. After all, people are saving these days, and they're placing the proceeds into various assets. That is to say, they're increasing their wealth the old-fashioned way by saving out of current income. And ultimately, that will be reflected, I should think, in measures of wealth starting to go up again. In short periods, of course, asset valuation changes dominate those flows. So stock prices or housing prices go up and down. That is what dominates the very short-run movements in these things. But over time, we can expect that wealth will gradually resume an upward track. When it does, though, it's not very likely to rise at 6% a year in real per-person terms the way it was for 10 years up to 2007. My guess would be that, and it's hard to be precise on these things, but something more like 3% a year would be what you'd expect. So I think this is a profoundly important point, and it's worth re-emphasising. The decade or so up to 2007, from the point of view of the behaviour of households, was very unusual. It would be quite surprising, really, if those trends, that is, persistent strong increases in asset values, very strong growth in per capita consumption, increasing leverage, little or no saving out of current income. It'd be quite surprising if those features were to re-emerge anytime soon. That is, the gap between the consumption line on this chart and the dotted trend line where we might have got to, I don't think that gap is going to close anytime soon. So if there were business strategies that assumed that we would revert to the old trend, they're going to be disappointed if indeed they haven't been already. There were, of course, when you think about it, several parts of the economy that benefited from that build-up in housing spending, household spending and asset values. Retailing obviously was one, and everyone is conscious that retailing is finding things much more difficult now. But think about banks. Banks and other lenders enjoyed very rapid balance sheet growth and strong growth in profits from the same set of phenomena. Those institutions can now see that that period is behind us and that things are more difficult now. It's much more difficult to get balance sheet growth and therefore growth in profits now. If you think about businesses that serviced the rapid turnover in the housing stock, like the real estate sector, turnover of housing today is a third lower than its average over the past 10 or 15 years, and it's about 50% lower than it was at the peak. So we are using a lot less of those services than we used to be, and that's having an effect on that sector, and it's also having an impact on state government revenues that come from stamp duties and so on. So the impacts of this change in household behaviour in the earlier period and then more recently have actually spread through some other parts of the economy. We can see some echoes of this, by the way, in business investment spending. Let me just show you that and make a couple of points as well. This is in keeping with the other charts. It's business capital expenditure, and it's measured per head of population, and it's measured in real terms adjusting for inflation, and it goes from 1960, quite a long time series. And the point here is that for quite some years, even before the mining boom got going, business investment was growing quite strongly. Over 6% a year per head of population, more than double the trend rate of growth in the preceding 35 years. If you take the four strongest growing sectors in percentage terms that helped to make up that strength, they included banking, the retail sector, and another sector called rental hiring and real estate services. So at least part of that is the sort of property sector. So we were seeing strong growth in business investment in some of these sectors that face the consumer, if you like, in the economy. And some of those sectors are, of course, slowing down their investment rate now. And as you can see, business investment in non-mining has been tailing off for a couple of years now. Meanwhile, mining investment has been growing at extraordinary rates. In 2005, mining investment was about 2% of Australia's GDP, and that is roughly the long-run average, between 1% and 2%. By the middle of 2014, we expect that it will reach at least 9% of GDP. That is more than 4 times its normal size. And you can see on the chart here, these are, by the way, logarithmic scales, so each increment is a doubling. And so you can see mining investment has roughly doubled, and it will double again over the next couple of years. And by then, it's going to be about as big as mining and as investment in the whole of the rest of the economy put together. So that is an extraordinary build-up in our capital stock going on in the resource sector. And that comes after a pretty strong period, actually, in investment in other parts of the economy. As a result of all this, business investment will, as I said earlier, reach over the next year or two a 50-year high as a share of our GDP. There is a very large build-up, therefore, in the nation's capital stock going on. If that's well managed, and assuming that it's soundly based, It provides the possibility of further growth in output and income over the years ahead. Now, the investment phase of the mining boom will probably start to tail off in a couple of years from now, is our guess. After that, the shipments of natural resources, which are in a sense the return from that investment, should step up quite significantly. One would expect by then also that some of the other areas of investment that remain quite soft at the moment will by then be picking up. More generally, I think over the years ahead we will be talking about the nature of investment quite a bit, because apart from the mining sector, we will have to be grappling with various other structural changes in the economy. If you think about the need for investment in the aged care sector or in public infrastructure, there are quite some big demands that may face us. So we'll be talking a lot about those investments, I think, in the years ahead, and also looking for the productivity payoffs of that investment as time goes by. But the key message I want to leave today, once again, is that the multi-speed economy is not just about the mining sector growing strongly and bidding resources away from other sectors and pushing up the exchange rate. It is doing that, but these changes in household behaviour, which I think lie behind a number of the other adjustments that we see, they were going to be happening anyway, whether or not the mining boom came along. In fact, if the mining boom had not come along, I think we would be feeling the effects of these adjustments by households rather more than we in fact do. The period of household gearing up could well have ended in a much less benign way than it in fact has. Well, what then are the implications of these trends for economic policy and for monetary policy in particular? Do we have any role in helping these adjustments? Well, one thing that I think I need to say is that we should not try to engineer a return to the boom in household consumption, low saving, gearing up and so on. Many people say to me, what we need is more confidence in the economy, and I agree with that, but we need the right kind of confidence. The kind of confidence that's based on nothing more than the expectation that house prices always rise and that an effortless way to get rich is to gear into rising house prices. That isn't the right kind of confidence. And we've been, I think, as a country, on occasion, a little bit too prone to that kind of confidence in the past. I don't think you have to be a believer that there's a bubble in house prices, and I'm not in that camp, but you don't have to be in that camp to think that sizable rises in house prices from where they are now, still quite high, would be a pretty risky approach. It would surely be a false basis for confidence, and the intended effects of our recent decisions on interest rates is certainly not to pump up speculative demand for assets. Now, as it happens, our judgment is that the risk of reigniting an unsustainable boom in housing and so on is not very high at all, and that's a key factor in why we've been prepared to lower interest rates over the past 8 months or so. So I don't think we should be trying to set monetary policy to foster a renewed gearing up by the household sector. We can, of course, at the margin, help the process of those who want to get their balance sheet into better shape with somewhat lower interest rates. To the extent that softer demand conditions have resulted from households or businesses restraining their spending in order to get their debt down, and to the extent that that restraint leads to lower inflation, which it does seem to have, then our inflation targeting framework tells us that we should ease monetary policy, and that's what we've been doing over the past 8 months. The reduction in rates we've had now, 125 points on the cash rate, something less than that, but still quite significant on the structure of interest rates that borrowers actually face, will speed up at the margin the process of deleveraging for those who need or want to undertake it. But it is, as I say, I stress, not designed to actually turn the process back into gearing up again. Now, in saying all this, of course, I'm mindful that we cannot ignore the interests of those who live on the return from their savings and who quite rightly expect us to preserve the real value of their savings. And here, it's important to note that a lot of popular discussion about interest rates routinely ignores that dimension. It focuses on the minority of the population, a little over a third, who have borrowed to buy the house that they live in, and it ignores the rest. We, as a central bank, of course, have to adopt a broader focus of that and to consider the interests of savers as well as those of borrowers when we make our decisions. And to repeat, it's not our intention to return to gearing up or to in any way overturn the current more prudent, shall we say, habits of households overall. All that said, I think it can still be said that returns to savers, particularly in deposits, if you do a bit of shopping around, are still quite well ahead of inflation, and of course they're very low risk. So monetary policy has been cognizant of the changed habits of households, the process of balance sheet strengthening that households have been engaged in, and we've been taking that into account in our decision. And in that sense, one element of the multi-speed economy, maybe one that people haven't seen quite clearly, but it's important, that one element of the multi-speed economy, the one most relevant to us, is something that has had some bearing on our decisions over time. The thing that monetary policy can't do is to make the broader pressures for structural adjustment in the economy go away. We can't do that. Not only are the consumption boom and the household borrowing boom not coming back, I don't think, and nor should they, but the industry and geographical shifts in the drivers of growth we're seeing can't be affected very much at all by monetary policy either. To a large extent, they reflect changes in the global economy, and there's nothing that anyone in Australia really can do to influence those. Even if as a society we wanted to resist these changes, I'm not saying that we should, but even if we did, tools other than monetary policy would be needed. And in fact, I think as a country we do better to accommodate these changes and to figure out how to make the adjustment less difficult and quicker and smoother for those adversely affected. And it's in that area, in fact, that I think we could do with more confidence than we have at present. The confidence in our capacity to respond to changed circumstances, to respond to new opportunities, and to produce goods and services that meet a genuine market need. We've done that before. There's no reason that that can't be done again. And it's, I think, to be hoped that some of the positive data that we've seen just in the past few days might give pause to reflect and to realise that actually, for all the difficulties that are no doubt faced, overall things have turned out not too badly after all, so far. So let me conclude. We face a remarkable period in history. The centre of gravity of the world economy is shifting to the east, towards Asia, towards us, even faster than some of the optimists might have predicted. Now, granted, that's partly because Europe at present is declining in relative importance almost visibly as we sit here under the weight of the internal problems that it has. But even if they handle these problems well in the near term, there's no mistaking what the long-run trend is in the centre of gravity of the world economy. That this comes at the end of a very unusual time for household behaviour and a time when that behaviour has changed direction is in fact a remarkably fortuitous thing for a country like us. We certainly have the challenge of adjusting our behaviour and our expectations to new drivers of growth, new imperatives for responsiveness and so on, but we do that with growing incomes, with low unemployment, and with an exposure to Asia that a lot of other countries would like to have. And that's infinitely preferable to the sorts of adjustments that seem to be facing so many of those other countries in the old world. The Australian community has understood that we can't base growth persistently on falling saving and rising debt. and that's forcing changes to household behaviour, and it's forcing changes to business models as the economy adjusts to that. But it has to be said, I think, that a certain degree of thrift, in fact, on the part of households strengthens our medium-term position. And if we can marry that with an ongoing focus on incrementally improving every day in 1,000 different ways the way we do things, that's what raising productivity means. When we talk about productivity, that's what that means. If we can combine better attitudes of thrift and a focus on productivity, then with the opportunities that we face, there's in fact a lot to look forward to. And in that sense, ladies and gentlemen, our glass is well and truly half full, at least half full. Thank you for your attention.
A glass half full. That was the Reserve Bank Governor, Glenn Stevens, speaking to the American Chamber of Commerce in Adelaide. He said that we should be taking a more optimistic view of Australia's economic situation and said that the nature of public discussion about the economy is generally more gloomy than it should be. But he did say Australia is unlikely in future to return to the boom period similar to the decade leading up to the global financial crisis, saying in the long run Australia's growth will be more moderate.